and all the people involved in putting this on at Manchester. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic programme, so I hope you have a fantastic time here. But time's sort of limited in this session, so I'm just going to go straight on. The opening session here is about inequality, or more precisely, inequalities. We're going to have 4 speakers, and in fact all of whom are either past or future to be presidents of the Econometric Society, and some the EEA as well, so they're well known to many of you. And they're each going to give short presentations, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Just before that, I want to take 2 minutes to give you some background to why we're putting this session together, and the Deaton review. At the beginning of this review, this year, with generous funding from the Nuffield Foundation, the IFS, where a number of us work, in collaboration with Angus Deaton, began a 5-year study of inequalities in the 21st century. It follows the model of our previous Merley's review of the tax system, which was, very successful and highly impactful. And what we do really in these reviews is we put together a panel of experts to commission evidence that will be published over sort of 2, 3, 4 years. And then the panel themselves deliberate on the evidence and publish their own findings and perspectives in the volume at the end. This particular agenda is even broader than the tax system, of course. And there are huge numbers of people working on inequality, many research centres, many flagship institutes. So you might ask, well, what is this one really about? And what we want to do here is be more holistic and bring together kind of all aspects of inequalities from both within and outside of economics. So if you just take one of these questions, for example, which inequalities matter most? Now that's kind of a very salient question, but if you sort of unpick it, you need to bring together evidence about inequalities between groups of the population, like male, female, gender inequalities, racial inequalities, spatial inequalities. Those between group inequalities are what a lot of other disciplines talk about all the time. And then you've got more general understandings of the shape of the distribution, whether conditional or unconditional, which economists talk about a lot as well. So different, top 1% share, 90-10 ratios, Gini's, non-parametric distribution shape. All of those are different ways that you can characterize inequality, and everyone talks about them differently. And then, we need to bring together evidence on different inequalities of what, if you like, whether it's economic things, wages, incomes, consumption, wealth, they all tell different stories. But then outside of economics, we've got skills, health inequalities, inequalities in access to justice, inequalities in political representation. All these things have got huge amounts of research on them that needs to be integrated together. And finally, what does it mean which inequalities matter most? Now, as at IFS and economists in general, we're used to telling policymakers, if you really want to design policy, you've got to target the causes of some kind of outcome. But if you think about what matters to people, whether that's to voters, to policymakers, to anybody really, whether inequality matters or not may well depend on what generated that inequality or not. Is it luck or is it effort? Or it might depend on the consequences of that inequality. If inequality enables rent-seeking behaviour, it might have very different it might matter very differently than if it does not. So all of these things are kind of the perspectives that we're trying to take. And this all points us to needing to understand the relationship between different types of inequality and understanding the forces that generate the inequalities in those relationships. And that's really what we're trying to do here, pull everything together. So really we're trying to take what a lot of people work on and maybe naively put it all together. So we've convened our panel of experts, and this is a picture of the panel of experts that have begun to start talking over the last 6 months. Many of whom are economists and many of whom you'll know, but I'd just like to point out that on this panel we've got philosopher, Deborah Satz, very eminent philosopher from Stanford, epidemiologist, Lisa Berkman, demographer, Kath Kiernan, social policy. And so the panel's been meeting, talking about this agenda and commissioning evidence pieces over the last sort of 6 months or so. And really what we want to do now in this session is I want to take 4 members of the panel, who you'll recognise over there, Orazio, Richard, Penny and Tim Besley, to bring together some of their thoughts on these discussions, and in particular the economic elements of these discussions, and some of the initial evidence that's been interesting them in this general area. After that, we'll hopefully have some time for questions and discussions. So really, as I said, the speakers need no introduction, and actually I'm not even going to give them any. So the first speaker is just Richard Blundell from UCL and IFS.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Let's see. It's great to be in Manchester. I had my first job in Manchester, 1975. It hasn't changed a bit, and neither have I. Great. Good. So, thanks, James. Fantastic introduction. We're only going to really touch on a few things here, and I'm going to take the perspective from kind of labour economics and household welfare kind of economics here, and think about inequality redistribution and its relationship to what's been going on in the labour market. And in a way, these themes and questions, challenges, are really what got me interested in the beginning with this review. Can everyone hear everything? Yeah, good. In the interest in this review, in particular, the idea, of course, from our IFS standpoint, that you can't address all the concerns about earnings inequality and its growth and complexity through the tax and welfare system alone. So how do we think about the key challenge here? How do we balance the tax and benefit policy with other policies, minimum wages, competition policy, thinking of competition policy partly as a policy that can have inequality impacts, whether it's competition in the labour market or competition in the product market. And those are kind of key issues these days. Human capital policies. And getting this balance right is going to be at least part of the objective of this review, thinking about how to get this balance right. If we look at the structure of work and families, it's really changed remarkably over the last 3 decades. Perhaps it always changes, but we've seen some remarkable changes over the last 3 decades with growing earnings inequality for both men and women, and adverse labour market shocks, particularly for the low-educated and especially for low-educated men. And you will know not just the economic impacts of those adverse shocks, but the political impacts and other impacts on other outcomes as well for those people and for the countries where these have happened. When we put people in families, in local labour markets, with childcare, marriage, human capital decisions, we get a very different take on tax and welfare design questions than we think of just individuals alone. And then when we put families in a dynamic context, redistribution and insurance become intrinsically linked. And they're the kind of way we, at least we as economists, think about these interactions. The key challenge then in this work is what's the best balance of policies? How should we balance the tax and benefit reform with minimum wages and policies to address low levels of human capital? How should we balance taxation of top incomes with competition policy that targets the rents of firms and innovators? So this is bringing together many dimensions within economics and, of course, outside economics. So here I'm just going to go through a few facts about the UK labour market. The project itself has, just like with the Merleys review, has the UK as a kind of running example. We're going to try, in all the work we do, to draw in evidence, and bring in new evidence for the UK, but in a comparative way, learning from what's happened and comparisons with the rest of Europe and with North America and perhaps other economies as well. At the moment, this review is focused on developed economies, and of course you could think of doing a global review on inequality, but this isn't it. This is a focus on developed economies. Of course, there's implications of our interactions with developing economies. So if we look at earnings inequality, this is a feature of many economies. It's a feature of the US economy, and it's a feature of the UK economy, it's a feature of the French economy, and many others, that earnings inequality, for men at least, has grown over a long period of time, or over these 2 or 3 decades. This is 2 decades of earnings growth for weekly earnings of men in the UK. And going back over 2 decades is a kind of nice period to think about when you're looking at the labour market here. This just tells you the percentile changes in earnings at different percentile points of the distribution. The percent change in earnings for different percentile points of the distribution. Notice I haven't got above the 95th percentile here, otherwise it would really zip up. But you can see it's a kind of monotonic, that those at the bottom have seen a real decline in their earnings, weekly earnings, and those at the top have seen a real increase. And that's continued with a little bit of a hiccup during the recession, but more or less as it stands. Interestingly, if you look at male wage inequality, hourly wage inequality, at least in the UK, it doesn't have that drop at the beginning. And that's an interesting feature when you think, put this together, how can that be? Of course, what's driving the bottom is a lot of things, but one of the things that's driving the bottom is what's happened to the minimum wage. The minimum wage, in fact, increased quite strongly in real terms over this period at the bottom of the UK wage distribution. And it's offset the otherwise fall here. But how can you put these two together? Well, what's happened is, quite interestingly, that hours of work for low wage workers in the UK, especially men, has fallen back over time. So the falling attachment that you see, say, in the US of low wage workers or otherwise low wage workers has happened in the UK with a fall in hours of work, not a fall, so much of a fall in employment. You put the two together, even though you're jacking up the minimum wage, earnings can fall back because hours are falling back. And we need to understand exactly what's going on there. I should say that part of the work going on for the review in this area is by Julia here and Steve Machin, and they've been looking at this and show that it's even stronger among the sole self-employed, which have also increased over this period. I may come back to that as I go along. When you look at women, there's a very different story. Again, very strikingly similar to what's happened in the US. Growth in earnings and wages over this period is much stronger for women than for men in the US and in the UK. And what's happened, it's almost like a butterfly symmetric picture. For women, earnings inequality has increased at the bottom. Earnings growth has increased at the bottom, but wages haven't really. And again, it's all about labour supply, actually. What's happened at the bottom for women is a much larger increase in employment and hours of work, exactly the opposite to men. In fact, if you draw them together, it looks like low-wage men and low-wage women are becoming increasingly similar in the labour market. And that's an interesting aspect of what's happened in the labour market. But with assortative partnering and anyway low earnings, female earnings share, this kind of opposite pattern, if you want, for men and for women, hasn't changed the overall growth in inequality of family earnings. If you look at family earnings, that's workers in families, take all families together with all their earnings and look at earnings growth in the UK, the same would be true in the US. You see a strong growth in inequality. At the bottom, there's a real decline in earnings growth, a lower growth in earnings growth. It's not negative, and the reason is because of increased work and earnings for women. But of course, because of assortativeness and the lower share of females in the earnings anyway, it doesn't offset the growth in earnings that you saw for men. And so earnings inequality is a really a key feature of what we've seen. You might think that's a little odd, thinking if you've seen some things from IFS that says, in fact, in the middle of the distribution, income inequality didn't change at all over this period. And that's the answer here. This is the growth in post-tax disposable income inequality for families in the UK. It's completely flat. It grows strongly. Remember, again, it's up to 95. If I put the top 1%, you'll see a huge growth. And the difference between these two is largely what's happened in the tax and benefit system. And you'll see a similar-ish but not a strong effect, at least in North America. And what's happened over this period, this is the growth in spending on tax credits, earned income tax credits that are like a wage subsidy over this period. And you can see over these decades of that strong underlying earnings income inequality, you get a strong growth in expenditure on these redistributive tax credits, which focus on supporting earnings in work. So again, you can see how tax credits have done this offsetting effect and other benefits in too. But look what happens, we get a new government, or something happened in 2010, and policies change. There's a flattening off, and now a decline in the real value of these transfers, certainly to income in work. And what's been the view? Well, here in fact is what's going to be rolled out in the UK. It's a fairly disturbing picture of what may be rolled out. This is our view of what will be implemented, fully implemented. These are fully implemented, and these are proposals for the change in redistributed tax and benefits across the distribution in the UK. So a heavy decline in those things that used to support low earnings in work. Well, what was the motivation behind that? Well, the motivation was the idea, certainly in, and this is an idea gathering force in many places, is there's too much transfer redistribution through tax credits, and we should be doing something else. What's the something else? Well, one bit of the something else is minimum wages. Isn't it a good idea to instead of just supporting low wages, to increase minimum wages? And there's two aspects to that. The first is minimum wages are very good at supporting low wages, at least up to a point. I'll come up to that. They're not particularly well targeted towards low family incomes and low family earnings. And that's because family earnings can be low, and but it may be that they're too lowish earnings, but not necessarily right on the minimum wage. And minimum wage workers tend to often be in families with other above minimum wage workers. So you can see what the minimum wage targets tends to be around the third and fourth deciles of the working age income distribution, rather than right at the bottom, although there's some transfers here. Really, you could think of this balance as really a kind of a complementary between the two policies here. The other things to focus on as labour economists, at least in this issues around labour market inequality, is just how depressing it is to be in the bottom of the labour market. You've seen pictures like this. These come out of any pictures of what's happened to wage growth by age for different education groups. And you can see those with, this is women in the UK, those with at least a degree have a strong profile of growth, and then it flattens off. By the way, for men it doesn't flatten off. The flattening off for women here is all about having children and going into part-time work and losing human capital. I can show you the men, but the profile is strong at the beginning. But those that leave education with mid-levels of education, kind of A-levels, high school completers, have some profile but low and flatten off. Those who leave with basic qualifications have a very flat profile. There's almost no career progression, at least on average. And that's increasingly so. It looks like, if you look at the US and the UK, increasingly the divergence of profiles by education groups seems to be getting stronger. And that's a really worrying aspect of what's going on with wages in the labour market. If you look at other effective things that are going on in the labour market that might offset this, let's look at the amount of training done in the labour market. Similar story, not just in the UK, by the way. Got similar pictures for Scandinavia. These kind of things that happen that boost your career, boost your earnings through your working career, tend to also be very complementary with your initial education. So this is the proportion getting a reasonable amount of training during the working year by different education groups and age. And you can see that it's pretty monotonic in education. These are the degree guys, these are the high school completers, A-level, and these are the basic. Almost no training going on for the lower education. So that doesn't help much either. Also, look at the bump for women. This is kind of interesting. A new interesting feature of training is that a lot of new training goes on when women come back into the labour market after kids, and that's pretty key actually in helping with human capital. And a little bit for this group too, but again, not much going on at the bottom here. So that's a kind of interesting flavour. It's depressing at the bottom of the labour market. And that's a depressing finding. In a way, what's happened about wage progression is, to me, the most depressing thing that I've found in any empirical evidence I've been involved in. there's little wage progression for low staff. And why is that the case? Why is it the case? And that's what we need to understand. I have a few comments on that in wrapping up here. But what it really means is with the change in real earnings and this lack of progression is that employment is increasingly not enough to move out of poverty and for longer run self-sufficiency. So the profile and progression in work is about self-sufficiency. If we can get people in work, they'll earn their way into a good living wage, as it were. That doesn't seem to be happening. Employment is not enough, and there's diverging profiles over time now by education. That's a really worrying feature because many of the policies, like tax credit policies, were about encouraging work at the extensive margin, bringing people into work, and then they earn their way out of low family incomes. Additional to that, although we've seen this growth at the bottom as well of labour supply of women, it's not been enough to turn around earnings inequality at the family level. That's what you saw there. And that's partly because of the strong assortativeness by wages of men and women who couple up in the labour market. It's very, very strong. And at least at the bottom of the distribution, it looks like assortativeness has become even stronger, although those kind of things are very sensitive to the way you deal with selection. But that's a key issue here. Policy options, and I'm wrapping up here, James. So there are many, and that's what I meant about the mix, but what I've tried to do here is give you a flavour for the way we're thinking about how all these things mix together. Earned income tax credits, that's been a very powerful and across party political support until recently as a way of at least a short run way of addressing increased earnings inequality. But what does it do for wage progression? In fact, in some senses it might preserve low progression. And it could have large incidence effects. Who really gains from earned income tax credits? Those who suggest minimum wage is a good complementary policy would argue that in fact some of that tax credit is subsidising firms, and that of course depends on the level of monopsony and other aspects in the labour market. So that's going to be key, which brings you on to the minimum wage. It's not so well targeted due to family earnings inequality and the fall in male hours, but we should think of it as a complement to tax credit. I was going to have a whole bullet point on basic income, but I somehow just can't find the evidence to support the basic income policy. It just doesn't add up in my mind. And that's when you put all the kind of conditionality that we have in the current redistribution system, try and get anything like that working in basic income. And of course it becomes hugely expensive. The other policies that we want to bring in here, which are less the kind that we look at typically when we're just looking at redistribution, but how should we balance competition policy and contract regulation? We have lots of evidence of increasing markups. What does that mean for bargaining power of workers? And this increase in the solo self-employment and gig economies, that is workers working as self-employed on their own with no employees. That's a growing share of the labour market, and that's an important aspect. What happens to them in terms of their ability to bargain and get wage progression? And then finally, how should we think about tax? How should we think about training incentives and human capital? As far as I can see, and I'll just point to that, what we've learned about the low educated is that where they can benefit in the labour market is through soft skills. They're relatively easy to teach, to learn, and they have a relatively big return, and similarly women returning after children. So I've already run out of time, but you can see even in this little bit of the review there's a lot of excitement and a lot of interaction of what we don't always think of as pure redistributive type policy. So the challenges of finding this balance and of course thinking about the balance of these policies. So tax and benefits, surely one key policy, but certainly not the only one. So that's me done.
In the interest of time, we're just going to go straight through, and our next speaker is going to be Penny Goldberg. So we're delighted to have Penny on the panel, and we're delighted she's here to speak to us today. Of course, Many of you will know her from Yale, and she's now chief economist of the World Bank. And she's going to speak on more trade-related aspects of inequality, I think.
It should be there, the next one.
Okay, so I hope you can hear me. Maybe I should turn this on. I don't have a very loud voice, so I think I'll stay here. If you cannot hear me, please let me know. Okay. Is it better? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and part of the attraction for me, apart of course from the composition of the panel, was in the title. It's the plural in the word inequality. So as Richard pointed out, inequality is a very complex phenomenon with many different dimensions to it. And I think when we just focus on the Gini coefficient, we miss many important issues. So what the Deaton review aims to do is bring many different perspectives to this debate. And given my background and also my current position, I'm going to focus and I'm going to represent mostly those dimensions of inequality that are tied to globalization. And so globalization is going to come in the review in many chapters, primarily in the chapter on immigration, in the chapter on trade, and also to a certain extent in a chapter on firm market power. So today, given all the time constraints, I'm going to focus mostly on trade, and I will talk a little bit about market power. I will not talk about immigration. So our time is characterized as the age of globalization, and this graph tells you why. After World War II, worldwide exports have been increasing. They have increased in many countries. What this graph shows you is total exports as percentage of GDP. So you can see a clear trend. Exports have been rising over the entire period. But then, if you look carefully, there is this period in the 90s when the growth accelerates, and that's what people refer to as the hyper-globalization of the 90s. To a large extent, this is driven by China. China here is in red, but it's not confined to China. I will come back to China in a moment. It's a worldwide phenomenon, so the purple line shows the world as a whole, but it also happens in many countries of the world, including advanced economies. But importantly, it also happens in in many developing countries, not all of them. So for example, the green line here is India. Okay? So this is the first thing to point out. At the same time, in the last 3 years, we're experiencing an enormous backlash in advanced economies against globalization, and given where we are right now, I don't think I need to elaborate on this point, but I will just elaborate on one point that I think is important. I don't think this is due to one particular person or one particular government. I think it's fair to say that there is more to it. We saw it in the US with a return to protectionism. We've seen it in the UK with Brexit. Perhaps more importantly, from the point of view of trade economies, the World Trade Organization is paralyzed right now and faces a true existential crisis. So we're at a point in time where the multilateral system is under enormous strain, and that raises the question of why this is the case. The puzzle, to a certain extent, is that all this has started at a time of global prosperity, when countries were doing very well, especially in the aggregate. So especially the countries where the backlash is strongest, like the US. The US still has a very strong stock market. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. You look at the aggregate statistics, and they seem very favorable to the economy. At the same time, if you use public surveys that ask questions about attitudes towards free trade, towards globalization, even towards immigration, the public in general tends to have very positive views about trade and doing business abroad. In academia, there has been an explosion of work, of research on the aggregate gains from trade, many new theories, a lot of new empirical evidence showing all the different channels through which an economy, or actually all economies in the world, gain from trade. And so how is this all compatible with this backlash we're experiencing? Before I go on, let me just point out one issue when we refer to the aggregate gains from trade. These are existent, they're there. We can show them in theory, and we can show them through simulations in counterfactual work. But actually, one insight that recent research has had is that, at least in static models, the gains from trade tends to be small, and especially for large countries like the US and even the UK. Those of you who are in trade will recognize the so-called ACR formula. ACR stands for Arkolakis, Kostino, and Rodriguez-Clar. This is in a paper they showed that no matter what model of trade you use, as long as you stay within the class of mainstream models, you can express the aggregate gains from trade as a function of two variables, the share of domestic expenditure and the trade elasticity. So these two variables are a sufficient statistic from the aggregate gains from trade. And even if you're not trade economists, you can get some sense of what the implication of this statement is. If you have a large country like the US or the UK, the share of domestic expenditure is going to be large. So then the gains from trade are going to be small, the aggregate gains from trade. This is all based on theory and simulations. More recently, in the US, we've had the chance of actually putting all these theories to test, because we have a return to protectionism. So after many years, we've seen a return to protection through the increase of tariffs, which many people can view as, at least from an econometric point, plausibly exogenous. Then you can use that to actually try to calculate what the losses from the current trade war are. If you do that, and we've done that in a recent paper, the static losses tend to be very small. They tend to be minuscule, I would say. Of course, this doesn't say anything about the dynamic effects, the long-run effects. But my point is that the short-term static gains are very, very small. So are the static losses when you impose protection. So against this background, we have a time of global prosperity. Things seem to be going very well. And at least that's what the aggregate statistics tell us. And even if you change trade policy, even if you deviate from free trade, all the indications are this is not going to make a big difference in the world. So then why are we experiencing what we're experiencing right now? And the answer, to a certain extent, may seem obvious. It's not about the aggregate, it's about the distribution. So this provides, in my view, a very strong justification for actually shifting the focus of the discussion from the aggregate effects towards the distributional effects. And investigating, in particular, the role of rising inequality. So that brings me to the next point. What exactly do we mean by inequality in that context? And so here is a schematic just to help us organize our thoughts. So in the context of globalization, I think it's important to distinguish between what I will call global inequality and within-country inequality. And by global inequality, I mean the inequality you would get if you pool all the citizens of the world to one pool and you consider the question of how has inequality within this pool changed over the last decades. And within-country inequality, again, there are many different dimensions that you can explore. From a trade point of view, it makes sense to distinguish between two dimensions, the one that views people as consumers and one that's based on the view that people are also workers. Of course, most people have both roles in the economy. So with that in mind, let me say a few words about global inequality first. So I think all the evidence points to a very drastic reduction in global inequality after World War II. So I will refer very briefly to Deaton's book, The Great Escape. There was a report by the World Bank, the World Development Report in 2006 made this point. More recently, Branko Milanovic, his book on global inequality. And even, there is a more recent version of all this work by many people, including Piketty and Saez and so on, that provides new evidence on this question. But even if you take this evidence into account, I think in the end, the conclusion is that global inequality has been reduced, poverty has been reduced dramatically, especially if you take out the top 1%, and that globalization, in particular the integration of East Asian economies, so of course we all think mainly here of China, but also there are others, Korea, for example, more recently Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. The integration of these economies into the world trading system has played a very important role. That raises the question whether there is a trade-off between global inequality and within-country inequality. I think this is a very interesting question. I wanted to put it on the table, but also point out that this is not what the Deaton review is going to do. Our goal is going to be to focus on this question mostly from the perspective of developed countries, of advanced countries, and ask the question of what role the within-country changes in inequality have played in this backlash that I recently described. That said, to me, it's an open question whether this decrease of global inequality has happened at the expense of within-country inequality, and whether this doesn't, to a certain extent, explain what we see. Now, coming to within-country inequality, most of the work today has focused on the labor market effects of globalization. There's a lot of work in this area. And so the work that views people as workers. So all this work, let me say a few words about the labor market for the US and Europe in particular, since this is going to be the focus of the Deaton review. Here are some things that have been documented over time. There was an increase in the skill premium in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The literature has documented polarization starting in the late 90s, and also a very sharp decline in manufacturing employment in the last 15 years in the US. The question is, what role did globalization play in all these trends? And what we know so far is the following. So it's very tempting to employ the workhorse model of international trade, so the Heckscher-Ohlin model, to address these questions. It provides a very natural way of tying comparative advantage to what happens to factor returns and to the skill premium. However, this has been done a lot in the last 20 years. The consensus that has emerged in the literature is that trade played only a very small role in the increase in the skill premium. And to the extent that it did play a role, this was mostly in interaction with technology. Technology was the primary culprit there. This consensus has started to change in around the year 2000. And then many papers emerged that pointed out that trade could potentially play a more important role. The question is why, and there are two explanations that come to mind that are particularly relevant, I think, for countries in Europe, for advanced countries in general. The first one is that it's all driven by China, by the emergence of China. The second one is that our attention has shifted from the skill premium to the special dimension of inequality, to regional inequality. And I will briefly argue here, again, these are all questions that we are planning to investigate in depth in the Deaton review, but I will argue that it's perhaps the second reason that's more important than the first. So let me say a few words about China first. So the effect of the so-called China shock has been documented in a series of papers by ADH, so Autor, Dorn and Hanson, and also by Pierce and Schott in the AER. The claim of these papers is that China played a very important role in the decline of manufacturing employment in the US. And this is the graph that tells this story. So this graph is taken from Pierce and Schott from the AER paper. And what you can see is, so this is manufacturing employment in millions. Since 1948, it goes up and down. So the shaded areas are recessions. It goes down as you would expect, but then it always bounces back up. Now, we come here to this recession, 2001. It goes down, and then it never recovers. And then about 3 million jobs are lost over 3 million in a span of 3 years. So if you ask yourself what happened around 2001, there was a change in trade policy vis-a-vis China in the US. If I had more time, I would tell you the details. But I will just note that the effect that the trade policy changed indicates that policy here could be important. The other thing that happens during that time is China enters the World Trade Organization. So the timing here is very important. So the US is coming out of a recession. It changes the trade policy. China comes into the World Trade Organization. It can never recover from this recession, and employment takes in manufacturing takes a very big hit. So this is the story that people tell about China in the US. And of course, the question then is, why didn't we see the same dramatic effects in Europe? We did not see them in most of Europe. We did not see them in the UK. There are many reasons for that the review is planning to explore. We're doing work on the UK specifically right now. So one reason people always evoke is that the social safety net is very different in Europe. But to that, I would add that also the trade policies have been very different in Europe vis-à-vis China. And again, that shows that trade may play an important role here. The alternative interpretation, why people now find effects, is actually inspired by the paper of Autor and al. And so in that work, what they actually do is they identify the effects of the China shock by focusing on the differential effects that the Chinese import competition had in different commuting zones that were affected differently by Chinese imports. And they find very large effects. So they use the differential impact across regions. In that case, regions means commuting zones. It turns out that kind of approach was applied prior to ADH, was applied very extensively to developing countries. So we have a lot of evidence from developing countries, from India by Topalova and co-authors, from Brazil, from Di Carneiro and Kovac, and also from Kovac, from Vietnam, from Pouchnik, and so on. This suggests that it's not just China. Perhaps the reason people find very large effects now is because they are focusing on a very different dimension of inequality, which is inequality across space. And let me briefly show you two graphs that tell the story very well. This is from Di Carneiro and Kovac on the Brazilian trade liberalization. So the Brazilian trade liberalization happens here in the early 90s. So this part shows the pre-trends. To make the point, the pre-trends, if anything, were going in the opposite direction. And what you see here is what happens to employment because of the trade liberalization. So these are the effects due only to the trade liberalization after the liberalization is concluded. What happens is formal employment in the formal sector goes down for many, many years, and eventually it stabilizes, but at a much lower level. If you look at what happens to earnings, and again, these are earnings in the formal sector in Brazil, it's the same story, if not worse. Earnings are going up before the liberalization. This is the liberalization, and then they go dramatically down. And then eventually they stabilize at a lower level, but it takes a very long time to get there. So what this suggests is that these spatial effects are very important. They are long-lived. So in both studies, the effects play out over 2 decades. And perhaps there is much more action on that front than it is on the skill premium where people had focused on. So open questions for the Deaton review are, what was the experience in European countries with respect to these questions? What is the role of size, of country size in interregional mobility? So all these effects suggest that mobility across space is very limited. So one question is, do these results apply to countries that are really small? Or are they only relevant to large countries, and why are people not mobile across space? How long is the long run? What is the role of policy in all this? Let me conclude with some thoughts on the work on within-country inequality as it relates to the role of people as consumers. All the models in trade tell us that free trade should benefit consumers in the form of lower prices, higher quality, more variety. There is very little empirical work on these issues, partly because it's really hard to identify these effects, and it's also very hard to measure them. And one of the objectives of the Deaton review is actually to provide more evidence on price and quality effects in European countries. But let me just briefly point to one question that is closely related to this issue of viewing people as consumers. This is a graph that many of you must have seen. It's from a paper, it's still a working paper by Jan Eckhout and Jan de Locker, that shows an increase in markups starting in the 80s in the US. So this is the average markup. Think of this as being the variable profit. They reproduce this figure for almost every part of the world. And it's an open question right now. There is a very intense debate what drives this. So I will make the claim that perhaps globalization has something to do with that. I don't think globalization explains this completely, but I think it may explain it to a certain extent. And this is based on, again, on some evidence we have from developing countries, and specifically India. So what happened in India as a result of a major trade liberalization is, this is a case where we can actually measure many of the margins I mentioned before. We found that the liberalization did reduce prices, it did increase quality, it led to greater product variety, but also it increased firm profits. And the reason, very simply, is what the liberalization did is it reduced costs to producers, but there is imperfect competition, so these cost reductions were not passed through in the form of lower prices to consumers. They translated to higher profits. That's the story in India. Overall, what happened in India is, yes, consumers benefited, and that's very good, but at the same time, firm profits increased. This is this is a figure from India showing pretty much the same pattern that Eckhout and de Locker documented, an increase in markups over this period. And as I said earlier, this is a case where you can actually identify the role of globalization in that increase. So I think it's plausible to assume that in this age of not just globalization, but more specifically of global value chains, where firms have the potential, have the opportunity to source inputs from the cheapest country around the world, thus depressing their costs. So in this age, it's very easy for firms to keep their costs low, increase their profit margins. This has been great for consumers. This is a great news for consumers, and we all benefit in that form, but it does create a distributional issue. Producer profits increase even faster. So this also may raise the question, to what extent did globalization contribute not just to rising profits, but also to the declining labor share as firms outsource more and more from other parts of the world and also to new technologies. So these are some of the questions that we're planning to investigate, and thank you very much for your patience. I will stop here.
Thank you. So the next speaker we have is Orazio Attanasio from IFS, UCL, and soon to be Yale. And he's going to talk about more like human capital and development type aspects of inequality.
Right. Okay, thanks. Does this work? Yeah. Thanks very much. It's very exciting to be here. It's very exciting to be part of the Deaton review of the panel. It's going to be a difficult project, an ambitious project, but I think lots of fun and hopefully useful. So as Richard pointed out earlier on, there have been, and Penny as well, there have been quite big increases in inequality that have been seen around the world in developing countries in income, but also in wealth and consumption. But there are, as pointed out earlier, there are other dimensions that are important, and we need to look at those, both because they are important determinants of individual well-being, but also because they may be quite informative about what's happening and what are the drivers of different trends that we see. So as we'll see, we'll look at inequalities in health. There is going to be, we're going to talk quite a bit about inequality in skills and in the process of skill accumulation. I will focus some of my time here on that in particular. There has been an increase in or decrease in the level of security that that households and people feel, and on the mechanisms that people use, formally or informally, to ensure against negative shocks. There's been big changes in family lives. I'll show you a couple of pictures on that have been leading to disintegration of communities, social fabric, and to an extent families. And there has been probably an increase in the inequality or a decrease in participation, an increase in inequality in political voice. All these things are important. And the other dimension that we want to look at in the review is that inequality is not just across individuals, especially if you want to understand what's really happening. And so we need to look at inequalities between group, ethnicity, across generations, across different places, geography, and also inequality within families. What is the position of women in the family, in different sectors, and the like. So these are all dimensions that are important. Let me show you a few pictures about some of them. There's been quite a bit of evidence accumulated on the increase in disparities and inequality in health. And they've been there for a long, long time, but they've become much more pronounced recently. If you look at the life expectancy and the like. And this is true in several Western countries, including the US, including the UK. And what has been happening at the bottom of the income distribution has been an increase in the prevalence of chronic conditions and what we call preventable deaths in some sectors. So these are some pictures. They're for the UK. They are similar to the similar pictures that Case and Deaton produced for the US. And you can see on the left-hand side is for men, and on the right-hand side is for women. And the green line is the is just mortality rates. And you can see that while there was a decline for many, many years, in the last few years, that has been reversed. And if you look at the causes of that, while there are declines in cancer and especially heart diseases, what Deaton calls Case and Deaton called the death of despair, there is a marked increase, which is what is driving the shift, the reverse there. And something similar is happening for women. If you look at how this is concentrated in England, you can see that is the concentration. So as the picture becomes greener, is the mortality gets worse, and you can see that the ex-industrial areas have been those mainly affected in England. If you compare 1993 to 2013. If you look at life expectancies for females at birth, there have been, again, this is by deprivation deciles, and so they're becoming things worse comparing 2016 to 2001, that gap goes from 6.1 to 7.9 years across different deciles. So things have been getting worse in terms of health outcomes. Now, here, when we look at family structures and what happens to communities, you can think of these both as outcomes, things we care about, and possibly as drivers of what else is happening. So family structure has been changing, and in particular, and particularly so for some sectors in society. Some of it might been affected by increasing in assortative mating. Richard was mentioning that when discussing wages. But also there is a perception that there is an increase in the level of fragmentation and segmentation of societies. Families are, especially at the bottom of the income distribution, have become less stable, and communities have been losing, many communities have been losing cohesiveness and sense of purpose and belonging. So these are some data for the UK. The yellow line is the share of 40 to 45 years old who are married or cohabitating. And so the yellow line is pretty much flat. And this refers to individuals with degree level qualifications. If you look at people with lower level of educations, there is a massive decline. This is the green line. There is a massive decline in the percentage of people living in stable families. Ownership rates that have been traditionally very high in the UK. So these are ownership rates for young people aged 25 to 34, how they varied from the 90s to today. And again, there has been this massive decline from over 50% to below 40%. Now, these are all some of the outcomes that we'll be looking at, but definitely in the Deaton review, we will study what is beyond the increase in inequality, what are the drivers of all this phenomenon. So we will look at inequality in the labor markets, and Richard was talking about that. Inequality driven by market inefficiency in the commodity market. That's what Penny was mentioning about the decline in the labor share, the market power accumulated by some firms. We'll be looking at the effect of trade, and that's what effect of immigrations. What I want to talk about in maybe 5 minutes is the inequality in skills, and both because they are important per se, and because they might play a very important role in the intergenerational transmission of inequality. If you grew up in a very poor family, one consequences might be that your development is compromised, is jeopardized, and therefore you stay as poor, if not poorer, than your parents. So we know now that the early years are very important. And we know that because different types of childhood skills measured at very early ages, and I'm not talking just about cognitive skills, but also social-emotional skills, seem to be reflected and drive important adult outcomes: wages, employment, health, crime behavior. In the UK, we are quite lucky in terms of data availability. There are some very high-quality cohort studies that allow you to look at the life course of these different cohorts. I'll be showing you some data from the NCDS, the National Child Development Study, which is the cohort born in 1958, and then the more recently born, the British cohort study born in 1970. And it's quite apparent, as we'll see in a minute, that the role that skills in childhood play is very important, even controlling for parental background. And a large fraction of these returns to these skills are mediated. They express themselves through educational attainment, although it's not all of it. And the other thing that we know is that, and we'll see in a second, that the inequality in these skills in childhood start very early. You already see them at age 7, if not earlier. Not only that, but the evidence we have from the recent cohort studies is that things are becoming worse, in the sense that more recent cohorts are more unequal, even when we look at very young ages. So this is, we look at the long-run effects of skills measured at 10 for two different cohorts, the NCDS, born in 1958, and the BCS, born in 1970. And there are three histograms there. The first is the return to cognition, measured at age 10. The second one is one type of socio-emotional skills, what we call externalizing skills. And then the third one is the return to internalizing skills. So these different measures of different types of skills. And you can see that they are there at age 42 in wages, they are there in employment, but also on health and mental health at age 42. And you can see there are quite big differences in some dimensions across the two cohorts. So an implication of that is that that's something, this type of mechanisms that we need to understand better how they work, but also those ages are very malleable, and therefore they are prime targets for possible policies. In a recent paper with Richard and Gabriella Conti and Giacomo Masson, we looked at now the 1970 cohort and compared them to the millennium cohort. So these are kids born in 2000, so they are now 19, 20. And what we could see there is that across the two cohorts there is an increase in inequality. These are the distribution for male and female internalizing and externalizing skills in the two cohorts. And you can see that there is an increase in the dispersion between these two cohorts in this type of skills across the two cohorts. And so we need to understand better what drives that. An easier way to look at increase in inequality is if you normalize, if you look across different groups. So these are with mother's education, so compulsory versus post-compulsory. And if you look at the numbers on the left, these are the return to the skills, to the maternal thing in those skills at age 10 for the BCS and the millennium cohort. And you can see that across the board for male and females and different type of skills, there is an increase in inequality there. The other thing to notice is that the parental influence on outcomes has increased. Here is a standardized math test at age 10, 11. Again, in the 58 and the 1970 cohort, you can see that the 1970 is a steeper slope, saying that the parental income is important in both, but becomes more important in the 1970 related to the 58 one. Now, if skill accumulation and skill inequalities start very early, parenting is going to be a very important driver, and it's going to be important to think about policies that affect parenting. So I have a couple of tables from a paper by Jackson, Kiernan, and McClanahan. Kath Kiernan is one of the panel members. So these are for the UK are the effect of you can have the education's effect, but then you can see the effect of shocks that happen to parents, how they affect the long-term outcomes. And so these are true both in the UK and in the US. When parents are on a negative trajectory, what happens to them affects dramatically the long-term outcomes for their children. And given what's happening in society now, This is important if you want to think of the long-term consequences of these shocks. So let me conclude with a few words about policy interventions. So I think there is important evidence that there are policies that seem to be effective in affecting positively the development of children from vulnerable families. Here I have 3 examples. One is a recent study at the IFS on Sure Start and the effects that the positive effect that it seems to have had. There is a really nice series of paper by Orla Doyle, who is studying the program called Preparing for Life in Dublin. And of course, there are all the study from the US on the peri-preschool program, the Besidarian program, and the like. So all these are very nice because they showed the potential of these interventions. Now, having said that, there are some important challenges that remain both for researchers and policy makers. We need to understand the mechanism through which these policies affect outcomes. And one important thing, we need to understand what parents do and why parental behavior affect things and how can we change that. We need to understand better how some structures work. Do we want to get better structures, educational structure? Do we want to change processes of teaching and the like? And very importantly, how do we, I gave you 3 examples of policies that seem to have an effect and they've been measured by rigorous methods. How do we bring those policies to scale nationally? Is a very big challenge. And we need to think about, related to that, how is the political economy of these interventions? It might be easier to build a new school, which might not be very useful, because it's visible for the politician and is going to get votes, rather than changing the behavior of teacher. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Orazio. And in fact, Tim Besley now is going to talk a little bit about the political economy issues, specifically around inequality. And then we're still going to have like 5 to 10 minutes at the end for some questions if those want them.
Okay, thanks very much. Apart from the opportunity to interact with some really excellent people on the review, one of my reasons for getting involved in this project was a feeling that we could fruitfully introduce some political economy thinking and to combine perspectives from not just economics, from political science, from social psychology and sociology to deepen our understanding of those issues. And what I'm going to do today is to outline, to begin with, very briefly, a framework that you'll be familiar with, and then kind of use that as a springboard for talking about some of the issues as I see them that we'll be addressing in the review. So I'll talk briefly about the standard approach, and then I'll spend most of my time on assumptions that I think need to be questioned, and then I'll talk a little bit about some data and then conclude. I'm not going to follow the full agenda here. The kind of standard schematic approach for how we think about political economy of inequality is that we think that the process by which political institutions aggregate preferences is important. There are underlying preferences and values that citizens have. There's technologies that we can exploit for the purposes of redistribution, and that leads to a set of payoffs, which is what we often end up studying. So schematically, there's a well-developed literature. Many of you will be familiar with it. And I'm going to give you a very stylized view of what I would think is the approach that most often gets taught, at least in the classroom, when thinking about the political economy of inequality, and some combination of Tom Romer, Kevin Roberts, Meltzer, and Richards this is attributed to. And it's a useful way of beginning to think about the issues, not least because it shows how limited the approach is when you kind of think through what it's saying. So in that framework, individuals care predominantly about their own consumption. They have different earnings capacities. And the main form of redistribution is some kind of negative income tax, whereby there's a collection of revenues, possibly in a progressive tax system, and the fruits of those revenues are distributed back to the population in some way, shape, or form. Political parties, typically two political parties, are trying to get the votes of a bunch of voters voting on the basis of their views about redistribution. And under some reasonable assumption, which Kevin Roberts in his paper called hierarchical adherence, you get a median voter outcome. And in that world, the income tax rate, the degree of redistribution in the system, if you like, depends on essentially on the difference between the mean and the median. And the main conclusion, and this is what I really want to draw out from this, is that if there's higher inequality out there, at least as measured by the mean median difference, then you would expect to observe more redistribution. So redistribution comes from a motive to redistribute based on what's good for your own consumption. At least that's the way voters look at it. One way of thinking about this model is it says that democratic policy making will be responsive to concerns of inequality. So if we look at the charts that Richard in particular had shown, we should expect the political system to be responsive to that via this model. I'm going to claim that although it gives us a good flavor of some of the things that matter, it's a fairly useless framework for thinking about policy. And what I'm excited about in this review is to try and lay out a framework that I think is much more fit for purpose in thinking through the issues. Now we can begin by thinking through the assumptions of the model, and I think pretty much every assumption that this framework makes is questionable. Even though I think it does make it a useful benchmark, and I'll continue, as I'm sure many of you will, to teach it to your students, I think it has to be taught with a lot of caveats about its usefulness as a framework for thinking. So I'm going to focus really on the first of these in this short time I have available, which is preferences for redistribution. But there are three things that I think are palpably missing from the framework. The only form of preference for redistribution is entirely selfish. So people, when they vote entirely on their view about whether it's good for them or bad for them to have more redistribution in society. And we know from a wide variety of evidence that people have very strong views, not just about their own position in the distribution, but what's considered fair or reasonable for a society. And I would argue, unless we can think about that and where that comes from, so it's important in my view, and I'll try and motivate this later, not to treat that as an exogenous characteristic of societies. We won't get very far, I would say, in trying to understand the political economy issues. Another obvious critique is the richness of the policy space. There are many, many different ways of redistributing income beyond the stylized way that model works. And then, again, I'm not going to get into this, the nature of political representation. But one of the big issues that's come up so far in some of the discussions we've had on the panel is this notion that a lot of what people are stressed about when it comes to political inequality is they're feeling their voice is just not being properly appreciated or heard in the political process. There's a fundamental failure of representation, and a lot of the debates now going on about where populism is coming from. It's coming from a sense of frustration that we don't recognize the people we're electing and the political class that was created in the world before populism to be the kinds of people that truly represent our interests. And one of the features in a number of countries, if you look across Europe, where there have been new populist movements, one of the features has been a whole new generation of new kinds of politicians representing new interests. It's not the old politicians changing what they're doing. It's really this process of political entry is incredibly important. But that's probably all I'm going to say about that topic, because I want to focus in on this topic about preferences for redistribution. When you ask people, and I'll give a particular survey in a minute on which people are asked, people have heterogeneous views about whether they think that redistribution is a good or bad idea. And you might say, well, that's perfectly consistent with the Meltzer-Richards framework. They're just saying that on the basis of their own private income. But actually, once you put in a lot of other stuff to try and explain those preferences, and this is well known, some of you in the room may have worked on this, you get lots of unexplained components that are hard to see, not least that hard to explain. And the other interesting thing, and I'll show this in a minute, is there are very strong differences across different communities and countries. So if you ask this question in many countries, you get a large unexplained country-specific component, which I want to call, for the sake of a provocation, culture. There's something about the way different societies process this and socialize their citizens, I would claim, that really make a big difference. People care a lot about redistributive dimensions other than income. They care about region, gender, and different forms of social identity beyond notions of income redistribution. I think this is an important lesson for economists. We're pretty good at studying income inequality. We're not so good at studying many of these other dimensions and how they matter to people. And I think that's a lot of times why we end up being less effective in the process. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to use the remainder of my time to talk about some open issues, in particular where preferences come from. Where do people actually get their egalitarian ideals, or where do they get notions of fairness from? And I think it's reasonable, and if you begin to unpack the non-economics literature, there's a lot of rich discussion of this. They get it from forms of cultural influence. And you need to begin, I've got the reason I'm excited about this also is I have a book with Torsten Persson that we're working on the two-way dynamics between culture and policy and politics, where we feel you have to unpack the possibility of two-way causality between politics and preference. And that what you're doing is not just influencing policy, but those policies can actually have an influence on what people ultimately want or desire. So here's a very specific and narrow window on this. I basically downloaded and combined the data, harmonized data from the World Value Survey and the European Value Survey, in which they have a question which many people have looked at, called, do you think that incomes should be made more equal, on a 10-point scale? So 10 says yes, you really strongly believe it. 1 says no, you actually don't believe income should be made more equal. There's around 440,000 respondents in the combined data for about 103 countries, and you can get data from 81 to 2014, which is a reasonable time period. And as you'd expect, if you stick in a load of individual characteristics, you can do a fair job at explaining some of the heterogeneity, and I'll show you a couple of interesting things in a minute about the patterns, just to sort of provoke your thinking. The thing that has been observed in these data, and won't be a surprise to you, you get very strong and persistent cross-country differences. So once you've conditioned out all the individual characteristics, you are left with very large unexplained country differences in the way people think about this, which you might say, well, that just reflects the underlying economic characteristics in the area in which people are asking the question, which may indeed be the case. But I'm going to show you one thing again in the data in a moment. The thing that I sort of putting this through the lens of the work I'm doing with Torsten is the possibility that these are just not a source of exogenous variation. These are an interesting source of endogenous variation. So if you ask a sociologist or a social psychologist, they want to explain why these differences happen, rather than saying, I'm going to take these as exogenous variation and explain something with them. We think there's a kind of halfway house that's neither taking them as exogenous or endogenous. But you can think about that. So here's a couple of things you find to sort of provoke you. So suppose you look, so these are the unconditional data, but I'm going to show you the conditional look entirely identical. So this is looking at answers to the question, and I'm just doing the deviation from the sample mean, according to the year in which you were born. So if you were born before 1940, on average, you're going to be more pro-redistribution in these data. And reason I chose 1970, I figure pretty much everyone in the room here is going to be born after 1970. So on average, you guys, if you answer these surveys, say you like redistribution less than the people who were born before 1940, according to this particular source of data. I can condition out individual characteristics, and I'm talking about income, age, gender, what else, education, and plot the same thing. The qualitative pattern, you do shrink a little bit these differences, but essentially the same story that the younger guys are actually less pro-redistribution than the older guys. Sorry, I don't get that right. People born in an earlier generation. So there's something kind of interesting here to be thought about. Why does there appear to be these generational differences? Now let me show you the same thing by education group. So it's a standard low, middle, high education. The other interesting thing is when you condition out all these, well, I haven't shown you the conditional, the unconditional. People who are highly educated are generally less in favor of redistribution according to this measure. So I've got you on a double whammy. You're all in that group, and you're all born after 1970. So all you guys should be on average, at least in the cohort you represent, you're less pro-redistribution than the older, low-educated people. Now, I think this is surprising. This actually links to something that a couple of people have mentioned, Anne Case and Angus Deaton's work. And I think there's this very interesting aspect of increasing college education that's creating a kind of form of social segregation in society. So this actually links, I'm doing some work also on the impact of military service on redistributive preferences. So there was always this argument that what you did by putting people through military service was to really shift their social networks by making them mix with people from different social backgrounds. And so this would create a more cohesive society, people who had more attachment to other people, and that changed their notion of what was a redistributive outcome. And so we're looking at that using some of the preference data. This is the same thing with taking out the background characteristics, and again, you see the same differences. And this is with country fixed effects, by the way. So this is, yeah, okay, great. So what I did here, I want to show you one thing about this, that I take the oldest cohort, the youngest cohorts on the vertical axis and the oldest cohorts on the horizontal axis, and this is for the 103 countries in the data. And what you see is, you can see the country level heterogeneity here very clearly, that there's very different answers to the question on average, what your redistributive preferences are. But there's a lot of persistence over time. So if you're from a country where historically people have been pro-redistribution, you yourself are more likely to be pro-redistribution in even a later generation. So some of the ways these preferences are being reproduced, I mean, Orazio talked about the family as a unit of reproduction. And in fact, Talcott Parsons, who's one of my favorite sociologists, talks about the family as factories for producing citizens. That effectively what you do in the family, many of the values and preferences you have will be formed by that sociological experience of your family upbringing. And it looks like that self-reproduction of inequality preferences could be a big part. Of course, it's not just coming from families, it's coming from schools, it's coming from all the social interactions you might have that will eventually, potentially shape your preferences. One final provocation, if you look at this and you say, are more unequal societies more strongly pro-redistributive, the opposite is true. On the whole, high Gini societies have less pro-redistributive preferences than low. Exactly the opposite of what the kind of Meltzler-Richards intuition was all about. And in fact, if you plot high marginal tax rates, I haven't done it here, you get a very similar finding, that generally high inequality societies have low marginal tax rates, not high marginal tax rates. So there seems to be something going on that isn't being picked up in the standard framework. So what I'm claiming, and this is my last slide really, that we need to start not to think of just the preferences and values as data, and we'll put them through the mill. We need to think of them as part of a system, and studying the factors that make that system work. But that is only going to happen if we collaborate with people who kind of know more about this than we do, and that's generally, as economists, we don't know a whole lot about this, but potentially social psychologists and sociologists and others. If we can get serious collaborations going, maybe we can make some progress. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to all the speakers. Fantastic and very broad set of issues. We do have 5 minutes. If there are people who want to ask particular questions or open up for any discussion, I don't know whether anyone wants to. I can take a group of 3 questions to be asked. Anyone? No one's got any thoughts on preferences not being exogenous after all? Yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit, framework that everyone has equal rights. You mentioned in the third point that might be the representation. So interesting what you think about the inequality of political power, in the sense that poor people, they might have less political power in terms of voting or other things than the richer people. Could that be part of the reason that explains why the basic framework doesn't work, and linked to the case that where the larger inequality is actually associated with less redistribution?
Yeah, so there's a very long-standing debate in political science about how you changing political representation. So if you think about it, if we went back 150 years, there were very strong restrictions on the franchise, and then there was an extension of the franchise, and then it was extended to women. So then the question is, well, is that sufficient to ensure people feeling represented just because they get to vote for somebody? And then there are studies about political elites that show, in fact, the kinds of people who get elected, even under extended franchises, tend to come from predominantly middle class and upper class backgrounds. There are studies of working class politicians, but even within systems with very developed franchise, you don't get a whole lot of people who don't come from a middle class background in politics. But then there's a question, well, does that matter? Don't we just want the most competent, publicly spirited people? And I think a lot of this debate now that's going on about populism. So in Sweden, what's really striking, if you've seen the work that Torsten has done with co-authors there, is how the Sweden Democrats have essentially drafted a whole new set of different kinds of people into politics, because the kind of traditional political elite is no longer trusted by a segment of society. So it's not about, you always had the vote, but now you don't like the kind of people who are getting voted in by the traditional political parties. So I think we need to think a lot harder about political representation as who are the political elites that we are putting there, and are they really doing what we would hope they do? And then there's a kind of Stockholm syndrome, if you forgive the pun. Namely, maybe when they get there, they kind of get captured by the process, and they just become a part of a political elite and start to think like everybody else. So there is also this contention that once you go off to the legislature, you just become like all of them. So there's a whole set of rich and interesting issues there, I think.
Time for one more question. It's still just slightly before 2. Any other questions around? Yes. So it's easier probably given time if you just shout, if that's okay.
Wondering whether in the review you plan to look at global warming, because that may have huge inequality impacts in the coming years. On the schedule.
Anyone want to talk global on the aggregate? I don't know, either of you two. Any aggregate issues around climate change or?
So I would say if we were concerned about global inequality, there is a lot of evidence that climate change is going to have a disproportionate effect on the poor. But we are not going to do this. So we are going to focus mostly on advanced economies. And there I'm not quite sure that the effects on inequality are first order. To be honest, I haven't thought much about it. But
just make one comment. So in the UK, we have this Net Zero 2050 program, which is to try and become a net zero economy by 2050. And what's true is if you look at the work that the Committee on Climate Change has done, the only way you can do that is pushing up stuff that goes onto people's energy bills. And there's a huge redistributive part to that. And unless the government turns around and starts to reverse through, say, tax policy, what's traditionally been the approach is essentially you push up user charges, whether it be for transportation, for home heating. And so there is a kind of big issue there. If you're going to go through with a policy that actually does deal with this, it is going to be, you're going to have to worry about the redistributive implications of that and the compensation you might do. So there's certainly a link through that.
Absolutely. Great. It's 2 minutes past 2, and you're probably still finding your way around the various buildings. So I think we're going to draw the session to an end. Thank you again to all the speakers. And enjoy it. Great.